Hi, I'm Casey. I'm a professor in information science, and in part, I study online communities. And my very favorite online community since the dawn of the internet is Fandom. If somehow you're watching this video and you don't know what that is, the keyword is fanworks, and especially fan fiction. If you don't know what fan fiction is, you should go check some out and read about the continuing adventures of Harry Potter or Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock's romantic tryst. I can wait while you're doing that if you want. Vast wells of creativity and talent that is inspired by the things that people love and wanting to share that love with each other. I also used to write a lot of fan fiction. Also, I very occasionally cosplay. And none of this is a secret, but no, I'm not going to tell you where you can find my fan fiction specifically. According to Archive of Our Own, I wrote about 500,000 words of fan fiction between 2002 and 2010. And most of those words were originally written on LiveJournal. You remember LiveJournal? Were you also writing and reading fan fiction on LiveJournal? I suppose that every generation of fandom has their own idea of what the golden age of fandom was, but I certainly remember LiveJournal extremely fondly. But then what happened? I mean, and also before that, how did we get to LiveJournal in the first place? Where did we start? Was it Usenet? How did we go from Usenet to like Yahoo groups? But also people were using fandom-specific archives or even ship-specific archives, places like Gossamer. So how was the fandom age of LiveJournal born in the first place, and then what happened? Why was there a mass exodus from LiveJournal, and where did everyone go? And what did that have to do with the creation of Archive of Our Own, and what does it suggest about the future of Tumblr? So all of that, the way that transformative fandom, fanfiction writers, and consumers have moved across platforms over time in these great migrations is exactly what this video is about. But first, let me give you a little bit of background. My interest in studying online communities as a human-computer interaction researcher and an information scientist actually started in part with my love of fandom. It's even why I also went to law school, because I was so fascinated by copyright law. I won't give you the whole long history, but I will link down below to a fansplaining interview that I did that gives you way too much detail about how I got into this space. But just as some highlights, because these actually suggest stuff about platforms over time, my master's thesis was a study of role-playing games on LiveJournal. So, you know, people pretending to be Harry Potter in blogs. In law school, I wrote a law review article about copyright and fandom, and that ended up turning into the research for my dissertation, where I examined how copyright norms in fandom are enforced on platforms and how they impact how people use technology. I also have been on the legal committee for the Organization for Transformative Works since 2009. But most exciting, right after I finished my dissertation, I did a study about Archive of Our Own, wanting to understand how it was designed and how the designers made decisions and how it influenced and reflected the values and the social norms of the fandom community. Also in the process, I learned the amazing story of people who learned how to code so they could build this archive. And now, in collaboration with my PhD advisee, Brianna Dim, we have been working on projects around privacy norms in fandom and platform use and harassment and fandom as an LGBTQ support community and computational projects in fandom. And basically, it's been super awesome and I love my job very much. But all of this has something in common, which is that I'm really interested in how platforms shape and support fan interaction. But the thing about platforms is they change. This is good, right? Like, we're not all still using Usenet and Friendster. Technology advances, society changes. When I interviewed Archive of Our Own users in 2015, a lot of them compared AO3 to other platforms. Well, AO3 is better than fanfiction.net because of this, and it kind of reminds me of Delicious because of this. And I moved there from LiveJournal because of this. This was all super interesting, not that relevant to the paper that I ended up writing about those interviews, but it really sat there and sort of bumped around in my brain for a little while, and I wanted to dig in deeper. So in 2018, after Brianna joined me as a PhD student, we launched a survey. The survey was about how people migrated across fandom platforms over time. Maybe you saw it. We ended up with a Tumblr post that had like 3,000 notes on it. And in the end, almost 2,000 people filled out this survey where we were asking them to go back in time and tell us all about their own personal migrations. This was a lot of data. And we read all of it because science, and you all had a lot of really interesting things to say. Anyway, we wrote a paper, and here it is. It has been published in the journal Proceedings of the ACM on Human-Computer Interaction as part of the CSCW Social Computing Conference. I am, of course, including down below a link to the full paper, especially if you really want to get the science. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here about methods and how we analyze the data and the limitations of our sample and our data analysis. I have a feeling that if you are interested in those things anyway, you will want to read the paper. But here are the highlights of what we learned and why I think it's so interesting. I should also mention that the title of this paper, Moving Across Lands, is inspired by Henry Jenkins' 1992 book, Textual Poachers. In that book, he describes fanfiction writers as poachers who move across lands belonging to someone else in a positive way. But just as we move across media, we also move across platforms, often belonging to someone else. And that has a lot of influence on fan interaction. Also, fandom is pretty unique if you think about it. Unlike a lot of what we think of as current online communities, fandom existed since long before the internet. And I'm also sure that someday when the internet ceases to exist and we're all like plugged into the matrix or mind linked with each other or something, fandom will continue to exist. We are going to be brain linked into VR stories about our favorite ships because fandom is technology agnostic. We take whatever we have and we make something awesome out of it. But one of the great things about this is that we can think about fandom as an example of what happens when a long-standing technology-agnostic community moves across platforms over a very long period of time. And this is why all of the human-computer interaction researchers might care about this, even if they have never heard of fanfiction before. So first, what did this movement look like according to almost 2,000 fandom participants? Ta-da! This chart was the very first data analysis that I did, basically immediately after we were done collecting this data. If it looks familiar, it's because I went ahead and posted this chart on Tumblr at the time, and Slate even wrote an article about it, which I will link down below. But let me draw your attention to some highlights. Note, for example, that both LiveJournal and fanfiction.net have this rise and then a dip. You will notice in this chart that there is this rise and fall of most platforms, with the exception generally of what we saw to be the most current ones in use, which are Archive of Our Own, Tumblr, and Twitter. Maybe you can see yourself in this chart somewhere. Okay, so our first research question was, what causes migrations? Why do people join platforms? Why do people leave platforms? There's, again, a lot of detail in the paper about this, but I want to focus on some of what I think are the most interesting points. For example, why do people leave? Look, here's more data. The yellow in this chart is the answer that was essentially, I left because there was another platform that was better. As one participant put it, the new and sparkly phenomenon. Something better will always come along, right? I mean, when I was hanging out in Yahoo-based email groups in the early 2000s, it seemed like it was the height of fan interaction. Boy, did people jump ship to LiveJournal pretty quickly when we realized that it was better for archiving and for commenting and giving feedback to people. But that is a pull factor for migration. Another site yanks you away because it's awesome. But what about push factors? What makes someone want to leave where they are? One answer is design. And boy, did our participants have a lot to say about bad design choices. Like for LiveJournal, remember that seemingly simple change where they removed the ability to put subject lines on comments? Well, it pretty much obliterated some features that were common to role-playing games, anonymous fanfiction exchanges, and kink memes. A lot of people talked about how they saw these changes as a sign that fandom was not a particularly welcome demographic or that LiveJournal didn't want them there. And this was especially true after LiveJournal was purchased by a Russian company. Speaking of which, y'all remember 2007? Okay, a lot of interesting things happened that year in fandom. The first one was FanLib. So I won't go into great detail about that here, but the TLDR is that around the time that YouTube was so successful and people started thinking about the monetary possibilities of user-generated content, some dudes were like, hey, did you know that there's a whole bunch of people who are just creating and sharing all of this content with each other and no one is making money from it? How could we make money from it? Suffice it to say, this did not go over particularly well. For one thing, they were running ads like this, which does not make a lot of sense considering that fandom communities were like 90% women. Not to mention the gift economy of fandom, etc., etc. But the point is, this was seen as an attempt for an external platform to deliberately try to exploit fandom. Meanwhile, LiveJournal, the major platform that fandom was appropriating for both social interaction and archiving, had a couple of issues. Big one was the event known as Strike Through, and a lot of our participants talked about this event as the writing on the wall about the death of LiveJournal for fandom. And it was because of a policy change. A lot of people think that policy of platforms doesn't actually matter that much because, for example, people don't actually read terms of service. But this is an example of a time when it really mattered. Essentially, one day LiveJournal changed the way that they were defining illegal content. And so with a snap of their fingers, a lot of fandom-based journals and communities were gone. They were deleted without notice. About 500 journals and communities overall. They were specifically looking for keywords they thought indicated that something might contain, for example, child pornography. But caught up in this, in addition to, say, some erotic fan fiction communities, were also things like sexual assault survivor communities. Some of these were restored, and LiveJournal apologized for some of the things that were deleted in error and perhaps not handling this particularly well. But in the end, it really changed the way that fandom felt about LiveJournal and whether they were safe there. What we heard from participants really matched my own recollection. At the time, I was moderating a couple of fanfiction communities, and though they probably weren't actually in any danger of being deleted under this new policy, there was still this sense that we had to be very careful about everything, and so a lot of communities got completely locked down. They were made subscriber only, which made them a lot less discoverable, and in general just made the entire fandom community on LiveJournal feel more insular and fragmented and not quite as connected as it was previously. But overall, fans just felt like LiveJournal didn't want them there. These two events in quick succession led directly to the creation of Archive of Our Own, as well as the umbrella nonprofit that runs it and some other initiatives like the Fanlore Wiki and the Journal of Transformative Works and Cultures, the Organization for Transformative Works, or OTW. I could do a whole video about everything I know about the origin and design of Archive of Our Own, and it is amazing and interesting, and I will link down below to a paper that I wrote about it. But the point here is that AO3 does exist in part because policy changes by LiveJournal made a lot of people want to leave. Also, 2007 might have been the writing on the wall, but then things got even worse. In 2017, LiveJournal changed their terms of service, and now the only legally binding version is written in Russian. But assuming that the English translation is accurate, there were some real concerns about new provisions, including prohibiting political solicitation and performing any other action contradictory to the laws of the Russian Federation. So understandably, a lot of people were concerned that this wording implicitly condemns LGBTQ content, and even more people left. And that specific example was not the only policy-related thing that came up in our survey. For example, fanfiction.net's policy to not allow fan works about works from authors who don't like fan fiction. The Anne Rice problem. As you can see from this chart, policy was the #1 reason that people left LiveJournal. But it was also a driver of people leaving fanfiction.net as well. And also a large number of people specifically said they joined AO3 because of policies they felt reflected their values as a community. So in addition to these kinds of things that have to do with the platform itself, migrations are also triggered by community-based things. Basically, you go where your friends are. Of course, this is something of a chicken and egg problem, and so these movements tend to be tied to other reasons for leaving or joining a platform. Like, everyone else left LiveJournal, and now all my friends are gone, so I guess I will follow them to wherever they went. So these are some whys of migration. And it happened over a couple of decades. So our next question was, what are the consequences when this happens? What kinds of challenges does it cause for people? So based on the themes that came out of the interviews that we had conducted about AO3, we asked people about the challenges that they faced when moving platforms. These included things like lost content or lost friends or difficulty fitting in or difficulty learning a new platform. And lost content is particularly troubling. Fans have long been vulnerable to content disappearing. For example, GeoCities shutting down and taking a bunch of fandom archives with it, or fanvids being removed from YouTube for spurious copyright violations. There are even design features of AO3 that are intended to deal with this, like Open Doors, which allows for archives to be imported in order to save them. And also around the time that LiveJournal was shutting down, the LiveJournal clone Dreamwith also allowed for cross-posting and mirroring in an attempt to help people keep their content and to keep their networks going in some way. But overall, people felt that the overlap and redundancy just tended to make this kind of confusing and hard to navigate. And of course, this cost of a migration was not unique to LiveJournal. Usenet was a hub of fandom activity in the 90s and is in fact where I first discovered fanfiction when I was in high school. Thank you, alt.startrek.creative. One participant described Usenet's decline as slowly watching a shopping mall go out of business. Communities dwindle, and even those who linger will move on eventually when there's no one left. When you left LiveJournal, did you go to Dreamwith, to Tumblr? Did you manage to actually keep track of your community, or did it kind of fall apart? In order for a new platform to be successful, there has to be critical mass at some point. This is one of the reasons why there are so many social platform startups that just fail. Even when they're backed by a huge company, basically fragmentation becomes a big problem. When people don't necessarily agree to where everyone's going to go at once, it's a collective action problem. But on the other side of this, beyond fragmentation, migration can also result in communities being thrown together when they weren't before. So LiveJournal was organized into a lot of sub-communities where people could interact with just the people who were super into their ship, for example. Tumblr is not the same way. Tumblr is flat. And though you can certainly create community by browsing tags, people aren't good at following the don't tag your hate norm, and so people are always bumping up against each other. A lot of people in our survey, when talking about the challenges of moving to Tumblr in particular, talked about these norm clashes. A little bit of it was a sort of like, get off my lawn, you young people who don't understand how fandom works. And in fact, this was so interesting that Brianna and I explored this in a separate study and have written about social norm clashes in fandom communities and how they can lead to privacy violations and harassment. A lot of people also feel like situating fandom on Tumblr sort of changed the culture of fandom. Some thought this was positive and some thought this was negative. I guess it depends on how you feel about Tumblr culture generally. Okay, so this leads us to, what does it all mean? Aside from, if you're watching this, hopefully a trip down nostalgia lane. So part of our findings have implications for sort of general social computing research and the design of online communities, especially around the factors that lead people to commit to or break a commitment to a platform. One thing I think is really interesting is that obviously, part of the success of AO3 comes from these pull factors. A lot of people are interested in joining a platform when it fulfills a strong sense of group identity. Archive of Our Own was built by fans for fans, and LiveJournal was not. This is even better if the platform includes a strong statement of values that align with your own, and if those values are embedded into the design of the platform. Of course, our findings also suggest reasons why people might not leave a platform even when it seems like there's a good reason. So like, how come people are still on Facebook following Cambridge Analytica and a dozen other privacy scandals? There has to be a viable alternative, and it has to be viable from both a technical standpoint and a social standpoint. There are a lot of opportunity costs to leaving Facebook. And that is a whole other video. I will link below to a blog post that I wrote about that particular topic. So for a migration, you need both a compelling reason to pack your bags and leave and a viable alternative option. Maybe Facebook is just so entrenched that we don't have the latter right now. But what about fandom? If you look back to the movement chart, you'll see that those strike-through happened in 2007. The steep drop-off in use didn't really hit until a few years later, just as AO3 and Tumblr were really picking up in use. Because until they were both stable, people continued to use LiveJournal, and there were also a lot of cross-posting and overlap for a long time. So LiveJournal served both an archive function and a social function, and honestly, though Tumblr does social well and AO3 does archiving well, neither does both particularly well. So if they hadn't risen together, as shown here, it's possible that LiveJournal would have held on for longer. Our data included a lot of people who hate Tumblr. They hate it. But they also think there's nowhere to go. And keep in mind that this survey was conducted before the adult content ban that happened in December of 2018. So as a reminder, in December of 2018, Tumblr announced that they were no longer allowing adult content, including the infamous female-presenting nipple. And it let loose a, let's just say, flawed algorithm onto the platform to flag adult content so that people could be warned about the kinds of stuff that would be removed. It flagged everything from zebras to fruit to rotisserie chicken. And of course, the slew of false positives reminded us of LiveJournal's flawed removals of, say, communities of sexual assault survivors. We could see the parallels, right? At the time, I talked to a lot of reporters about this. It was very weird. I felt like the world's expert on what might happen to Tumblr when they did this, because we'd been through this with LiveJournal already. So at the time, we asked, what might happen if Tumblr falls? And our conclusion was, fandom's fate is not tied to Tumblr. Fandom has migrated. It can do so again. Of course, if this happens, it will be a slow process, as it has been in the past, and it will have a lot of these negative consequences of migration that we've talked about. Lost content, fragmented communities, normative changes, etc. If fandom does have to make a big move again, whether it's from Tumblr or something else in the future, it's very likely that people will lose contact with friends or whole communities. This can be particularly harmful for marginalized groups who might not have support structures elsewhere. And as we have seen in research that Brianna has led, Fandom is actually an amazing LGBTQ support community. So when Tumblr first announced the ban, people were already talking about leaving, and Tumblr users were encouraging people to follow them on Twitter, for example, where some fan interaction already takes place. Others were rallying around Pillow Fort, where a small independent development team had already launched something that looked kind of Tumblr-like and was in beta. Other pockets of fandom were starting to converge on Discord. Also, I feel like we're seeing this more and more as fans have concerns about those norm conflicts that are happening on flat platforms like Tumblr, where they can't really organize into sub-communities with their own interests and norms. However, an issue with Discord is that communities don't really have a way to interconnect. This means that if we move into spaces like that, fandom can become more siloed, which in some ways might be good, but also limits the discoverability of fandom, which I do think can be a problem for some of those reasons related to social support. Also, sometimes fandoms themselves rise and fall the same way platforms do. We did an analysis that showed the most popular fandom on any given platform, which of course in some ways is just a function of time. Star Trek: The Next Generation just isn't as popular as it was when I was in high school, and Harry Potter is not as popular as it was when I was in college. Maybe these stragglers of supernatural fandom have some overlap with the stragglers of LiveJournal, because LiveJournal isn't even dead when it comes to fandom. There's still people there interacting and writing fan fiction. Maybe they're in other spaces as well, or maybe they're not. There's always going to be a lot of overlap. So what is fandom going to look like next when it comes to online platforms? I don't know. But what I can tell you is that platforms will rise and fall, but fandom will outlive all of them. In 20 years, we're all going to be giggling about Facebook and Tumblr in the way that we think that Friendster and Usenet are amusing now. Fandom isn't going anywhere. It's not tied to any particular platform. It's the community that makes it. So I have given you a lot here. I'm going to include a lot of resources in the description below, including a link to a page that has all of my lab's fandom-related research on it if you want to learn more. And if you want to see more video essays like this one, consider subscribing to this channel. So far, I've mostly done videos with academic advice, but I really love talking about research, so I anticipate doing more like this. So again, I'm Casey. Thanks for watching and geeking out with me, and I hope to see you on the interwebs.